Sometimes, when examining the events of human history, we may be tempted to see an endless cycle of dynasties rising and falling. An example might be a kingdom split by two rival claims to the throne, leading to one monarch being deposed by another. Or a revolution which, once overthrowing the previous, crushes any attempts at rebellion to their new regime. If the ancient Greeks are to be believed, the actions of immortal creatures, even the gods, differ very little from us in this sense. Hello, I'm Minimus, and welcome to Silver Breath Stories. Today's tale comes from Greek mythology, and is a story of power and rebellion, of jealousy and paranoia. The story of the fall of the Titan. Long before the gods sat on golden thrones on Mount Olympus, the world was watched over by 12 immortal beings known as the Titans. They were a generation sprung from the union of earth and sky, of the great beings Gaia and Uranos. The Titans commanded the bare forces of nature with amoral power, mastering the raw energy of fire and water, the mountains and the winds, and the night and the day. The mightiest of the Titans was Kronos, who developed command over the changing of the seasons, and thus became the Titan of Time. As any elder who has suffered much, or any empire which survives past its prime can tell you, time can often be terribly cruel. And so was Kronos. Despite his power and prestige among his brothers and sisters, Kronos longed to conquer all things, just as time will swallow not only human empires, but continents and mountains when given its due. Kronos looked skyward to the castle where his father Uranos ruled from the heavens, and silently swore that one day it would be him who reigned in the clouds. Kronos' opportunity would come when his parents' relationship began to sour. What had once been a passionate and irresistible romance between Gaia and Uranos had grown loveless and cruel over the millennia. They argued over a great deal of things, but like many couples, they especially argued about their children. Though Gaia had always stood by her sons and daughters, Uranos was concerned by how powerful the Titans were becoming, and grew distant from his divine offspring. However, he was even colder to the couple's other more monstrous children, the giant Cyclops and the 100-handed ones. They had never been unloved by Gaia, who saw in their brutal features the beauty of the craggy face of a mountain, or the many-legged symmetry of the insects. But Uranos was repulsed by the ugliness of these creatures. They did not belong to his seemingly immaculate world of clear air and white clouds. In fact, he was so haunted by what he had sired, that one day he imprisoned them deep into the earth, so that their hideous visages would no longer pollute his view of the world from on high. This was the last straw for Gaia, whose maternal nature recoiled at her husband's cruel treatment of her children. When they fought, the entire world was rocked, as Gaia sent volcanic ash screaming into Uranos' previously unsoiled air. Uranos returned fire by delivering hurricanes and monsoons to wound the earth and uproot entire forests. Gaia soon realized that if she truly wanted to harm her former lover, she would need to turn to her other children, the Titans, for help. When she asked Kronos for aid, he agreed without hesitation. Gathering an army of his fellow Titans and the creatures of the earth, Kronos stormed the castle of the sky with his signature golden sickle in hand. Uranos' self-righteousness had left him very few allies, and soon the Titans cornered their father in his stormy throne room, spears and sword tips leveled under his white beard. They stepped aside for their leader, Kronos, who twirled his weapon and smirked. "It seems the heavens themselves cannot escape time," he mused. "Soon I will sit on your throne, Father, and rule all that I see better than you ever did." "Be careful with your next moves, my son," Uranos countered, rising to his feet slowly. For if you strike me down, your only father, you will find your sons will one day do the same to you." This prophecy filled Kronos with such a rage that he leapt at his father, not only killing him with the sharp edge of his blade, but mutilating him as well. His siblings looked on with horror as their brother hacked their father into tiny pieces and tossed them out of the castle's window to fall to sea and earth. When he turned back towards them, they raised up a cautious cheer. Kronos wiped the immortal blood from his blade and ascended to his father's throne. In the time that followed, the Titans celebrated their victory over their tyrannical father, and grew busy with dividing up the spoils amongst themselves. Kronos, however, did not take part in the festivities. He found himself feverish at the thought of Uranus' parting curse, that his children would one day do to him what he had done to his father. His wife, Rhea, grew more worried day by day. She was expecting a child, and Kronos' behavior around her and the growing infant was unsettling. He would often watch her and her nurses from afar, anxiously observing their care for Rhea. She noticed him growing more paranoid day by day, talking to himself and pacing through his father's former throne room, now the seat of power for him and his family of Titans. Soon, the child was born, a son with hair and eyes as dark as coal. His birth had been strangely silent, though the celebration of Rhea's nurses caught the ears of Kronos. He plucked the child from Rhea's hands and held him in his arms. It was only after he began to squeeze the child tightly that he began to cry. The nurses chattered quietly, too frightened of the unstable Kronos to protest, while Rhea, weak from the birth, looked helplessly as her husband lifted the child upward and swallowed it whole. Rhea screamed, and several of the nurses fainted while the rest ran out of the room. Kronos watched them go and wiped his mouth with his cape. "Do not be frightened, wife," Kronos said with an eerie calm. "I only do what is best for our new kingdom. You heard our father's curse. You know what this child is capable of. Now our son's power flows through me, and I remain the only being capable of ruling this world." The absorption of another immortal being had indeed increased Kronos' power, and he was quickly able to smite any of the remaining forces still dedicated to Uranus. His fellow Titans grew more fearful and subservient to him, a trend which Kronos noticed and thoroughly enjoyed. This was so much the case that when he and Rhea's second child was born, a daughter, he devoured her as well. Though Uranus' curse pertained only to his sons, the power Kronos gained from this unholy act of cannibalism fueled a desire that he could not ignore. In the centuries that followed, Rhea gave birth to 3 more children, all of which found themselves consumed by Kronos' expanding maw. With each infanticide, Kronos grew more powerful and more tyrannical, ruling from his throne in the sky with an iron fist and bending the mortals of Earth to his will. He declared a new golden age for humanity, though thousands died erecting massive monuments in his honor, and the world was devoid of freedom. After some time, Rhea found herself yet again expecting a child. She had watched in horror as her husband had gone from a Titan like herself to some other creature far more terrible. She decided that this time she had to take action. Though she told her husband that she was making a trip to the Earth to inspect the mortals, she and her nurses fled Castle Kronos and sought refuge on the island of Crete, where she gave birth to a final son, Zeus. She left Zeus in the care of a mortal shepherd and returned to Castle Kronos with a stone from the island wrapped in her shawl. Days later, she and her nurses staged a false birth. Rhea channeled the pain and horror of losing her other 5 children into her performance, and it did the job. Kronos himself was so unsuspecting of treachery that when he entered the room and was handed a swaddled stone in place of his final son, He devoured it without a second thought and left the room. In the meantime, Zeus grew up in the Cretan shepherd's watchful care, becoming a strong and handsome youth who quickly became the talk of the women of the island. His mother Rhea would occasionally visit him, ensuring he was aware of his divine heritage and the history of the world before the so-called Golden Age of Kronos. Warriors devoted to Rhea came to the island and began to train the young man for what his mother told him was his primary purpose in life: to avenge his brothers and sisters and cast down Kronos from his throne. Meanwhile, King Kronos had become complacent, and the voice of his father, Ouranos, less and less occupied his thoughts. So, when a young man named Zeus was presented by his wife to him as a cupbearer, he thought little of it. She did need to feel useful in the court of the Titans after all, so what harm was it if she were to provide the servants? "Well, boy," Kronos thundered, "if you were to be my cupbearer, fetch me a cup." "Of course, my lord," Zeus replied. He brought forth a goblet of wine and presented it to Kronos, who gulped it down as violently as he had Zeus's siblings. It burned the Titan on the way down his throat, and with a violent scream, Kronos soon realized that he had been poisoned. Zeus and his mother stepped backward as the Titan of Time began to vomit violently. First came a stone, followed by Zeus's brothers and sisters, who as immortals had not perished in Kronos' stomach, but instead grown into adult beings. They were Hades, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, and Hestia, and they were to become the gods. With their beloved children finally freed, Rhea and Zeus gathered them up and departed from Castle Kronos, leaving the old man lying in his own spit. Together, they began gathering an army on Mount Olympus, the only peak on Earth high enough to rival Kronos' throne in the sky. The war that followed between the gods and the Titans would tear the world apart for centuries. Mortal beings and beasts were eventually forced to choose sides, to either defend the throne of Kronos or support Zeus and his upstart rebellion. The tide of the war was turned when Zeus visited the prison where Ouranos had locked away his beastly children, the Cyclops and the 100-handed ones. Despite the protests of Mother Gaia, Kronos had chosen to keep the monsters behind bars, ensuring that the Titans were the undisputed heirs to Ouranos' legacy. When he realized how valuable these creatures could be to the war effort, Zeus's clever brother Hades encouraged the leader of the gods to liberate the monsters from their prison. Once freed, the creatures pledged loyalty to the gods and their revolution. The 100-handed ones began a siege of Kronos' castle in the clouds, launching entire hillsides towards heaven and forcing the Titans to batten down the hatches and wait out the assault from the inside of the castle. The Cyclops likewise proved key to the war effort. Despite their brutish and rather dim appearance, the Cyclops were clever beings, capable of crafting great tools from ore and the elements. They pledged to create 3 great weapons for the triumvirate of the gods, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. For Hades, a helmet which allowed him to become invisible was created. Poseidon's gift was a 3-pronged trident made of bronze which would never corrode, even under miles of ocean waves. For Zeus, the Cyclops created perhaps the most powerful weapon of all, a quiver of thunderbolts, which when tossed could torch an entire countryside. Confident in their newfound allies' contributions, and in the new weapons that they wielded, the 3 brothers gathered their troops together and announced that this day they would storm Castle Kronos. Kronos' loyal Titans prepared themselves for a long siege, only to find that Hades, with his helm of invisibility, had opened the gates without their knowing. Soon the castle was flooded with Zeus's troops, and though they fought bravely, they could not resist, and soon laid down their arms. The 6 children of Rhea confronted their father in his throne room. Kronos swung his sickle at his offspring in a frenzy, while repeatedly muttering the words of his father. "If you strike me down, your only father, you will find your sons will one day do the same to you." Poseidon managed to disarm the old man, catching his blade between his trident's prongs and flinging it away. Kronos turned to him and said to him directly, "If you strike me down, your only father." But it was too late to prophesy. Zeus struck Kronos with a lightning bolt, slaying the once mighty ruler and sending his body tumbling through the castle window. And so, the curse of Uranos was finally rectified. With the war over, Zeus became the king and master of a new era, one where the world was governed by the gods and not the Titans. Those of Kronos' kind who remained either swore fealty to the new rulers or were banished deep into the bowels of the underworld. The exception, of course, was Mother Rhea, who would remain as an advisor in the gods' new seat of power on Mount Olympus. A new dynasty, one which would face its own challenges and tumult, was formed. Kronos, the Titan who had governed the changing of the seasons and the flow of history, had become himself a victim of time. Thank you for joining me today for this story of the fall of the Titans. If you enjoyed listening and would like to hear more stories from world mythology and legend, please consider subscribing to Silver Breath Stories. Whether you listen before bed, with your first cup of coffee in the morning, or on the road, we upload new videos like this every other Friday. Be well, and we'll see you in the next story.